History as it happens, January 10th, 2023. House divided.
Everything I heard hardened my resolve that this town desperately needs change, and if it's a few of us who have to stand in the breach to force it, we are willing to do so for as long as it takes.
A speaker has not been elected.
Mediate something here. It is getting really heated on the floor.
McCarthy looks angry. It's physical. Wait a minute. Hold on. Let's follow the camera.
We offered a deal.
House Democrats will always put American values over autocracy, benevolence over bigotry, the Constitution over the code.
That was easy, huh? I never thought we'd get up here.
After 5 days and 15 ballots, Kevin McCarthy got what he wanted, the speakership of the House of Representatives, but only after caving to the demands of a right-wing voting bloc that sought to reshape the very institution McCarthy desperately wanted to lead. The ugly spectacle evoked the 1850s, when slavery shattered the prevailing parties and split the nation in half. What can that era teach us about what lies ahead now? That's next with Sean Wilentz, as we report History as It Happens, podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, I mean, it's about political fractionalization, an old party system or an old way of doing politics falling apart. And we're seeing that the same way we saw it in the 1850s. This has been going on for a long time for us. I mean, it's not like it suddenly happened. It's been happening since at least the 90s. But it's not exactly the same, obviously. I mean, there are different dynamics at work. But what it shows is political instability, political volatility, and political fractionalization.
Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy now shares a place in history with Howell Cobb, Nathaniel Banks, and William Pennington. They're among 15 men who won the House speakership after multiple ballots. Only McCarthy and Frederick Gillette in 1923 happened after the Civil War. So you know what you're watching is rare if you have to go back to the 1850s to find similar situations.
As Speaker of the House, my ultimate responsibility is not to my party, my conference, or even our Congress. My responsibility, our responsibility, is to our country.
The longest battle ever, 133 ballots from December 1855 to February 1856. Nathaniel Banks prevailed in a political maelstrom of major party disintegration. The conflict over slavery, catalyzed by the KansasNebraska bill from spring 1854, had made it close to impossible to select a speaker satisfactory to all factions. As historian Corey Brooks writes in the Washington Post, among the lessons to glean from that fight, it exposes how important control of the floor is and how any victory will prove to be valuable no matter how narrow. The solidification of a new party coalition in 1856 also signals how extended conflicts over the speakership can have ramifications for party politics beyond the mechanics of who controls the House. That's historian Corey Brooks, author of Liberty Power, a book that covers antebellum political history. So how's what we witnessed on C-SPAN last week, watching the drama unfold? How will that affect the Republican Party? Well, it seems the right-wing pro-Trump fringe has emerged victorious here, although as I record this podcast, it's not clear which of the rules changes the anti-McCarthy faction demanded will actually be passed by the full House. Some Republicans are apparently unhappy with the way McCarthy agreed to weaken his own position. So by the time you're listening to this, there's a good chance the rules dispute will have been resolved one way or another. Just keep that in mind. So we've spent a lot of time on this podcast talking about the origins of Trumpism and the illiberal populism on the right. We've talked about George Wallace, Phyllis Schlafly, Pat Buchanan, Newt Gingrich, to name four. Rather than rummaging around the 1930s Europe looking for fascist origins, the anti-government right in the United States has American roots.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we've been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule, that government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. Well, if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then who among us has the capacity to govern someone else?
The issue in the 1850s was slavery. The issue today, as our guest will explain, is liberal government itself. Princeton historian and author of a magisterial book on the antebellum United States, The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln. Sean Wilentz, welcome back, my friend.
Great to be here, Martin.
And Happy New Year to you. Is it too late to wish people Happy New Year? Here we are.
Happy New Year to you.
You know, I'm going to start off by paraphrasing Michael Corleone. Whenever I think I'm done with the 1850s, someone pulls me back in.
Yeah.
Well, you know, this is what makes my work, at least I think so, exciting and fascinating. Whenever I think I may not return to an era or a name that no one remembers other than historians, of course. Nathaniel Banks suddenly pops into the news and a past era is relevant all over again.
Well, Nathaniel Banks, yes. I mean, who knew?
William Pennington, Howell Cobb. We're going to get to those names. But before we dive into the history, what was going through Sean Wilentz's mind as he watched the House take 15 ballots to elect Kevin McCarthy?
Well, lots was going through my mind. I mean, I can't say the history was going through my mind right away. It was a weird political theater, much as anything else. I mean, especially Representative Gates. I mean, he sure knows how to throw a show, and he did it to the max, which is what a lot of this was about. I mean, one of the things, unlike the 1850s, the things we're going to be talking about, the 1850s was not broadcast on C-SPAN or CNN or anything like that. So there's elements of showmanship here, political showmanship, which are different. I mean, back then they were hitting each other over the head, but now they're almost hitting each other over the head, but it's in service of a different kind of thing. It's in service to a national audience, which is really what they're doing.
You know, my social media feeds are tailored to follow news organizations and historians, and I often see what historians are saying about current events, and it didn't take long for people to start mentioning Nathaniel Banks, the fights in 1849, 1855, 1859-60. You know, of course, history always has plenty of lessons to offer, but it's which are the right ones. When the history started to enter your mind as you were watching this, you know, the imbroglio in the House, you know, what was relevant to you?
Well, I mean, it's about political fractionalization, an old party system or an old way of doing politics falling apart. And we're seeing that the same way we saw it in the 1850s. This has been going on for a long time for us. I mean, it's not like it suddenly happened. It's been happening since at least the 90s. It's not exactly the same, obviously. I mean, there are different dynamics at work. But what it shows is political instability, political volatility, and political fractionalization. And what's going to come of it, we don't know. It would take a bold person to say that, well, some people actually say this, that we're on the verge of another civil war. That's the outcome of the 1850s, obviously. I don't know if that's going to happen, but we're certainly in a moment of political crisis, political crack-up.
Dysfunction.
Well, dysfunction, yes, but you can have dysfunction without crack-up. There have been dysfunctional periods in American politics, but this is different. This is a matter of the institutions themselves, and not just the parties, but in fact, as we saw from January 6th 2 years ago to January 6th, 2023, it's institutions that are actually in crisis as well. So this is why it's particularly, for an historian, it's riveting, but as a citizen, it's kind of scary as well as everything else.
Well, I thought of something that William Freeling brought up in his Road to Disunion books. You've probably made this point as well, as have others, that our two-party democratic system has a dangerous vulnerability. A small group of radicals can hold up everything if they stick together as a block, and in an evenly divided chamber, right, they hold the balance. So we had this 20 holdouts who got their concessions from McCarthy. That's 20 people holding up a chamber of 435. I mean, I thought of the fire eaters in the South. Not a perfect analogy, but...
Well, but it can also go the other way. I mean, in 1849, when it was the anti-slavery people who held the balance of power. So it can go in either way. But, you know, look, sometimes that can be a useful thing in that, you know, as in the 1840s and 50s, I mean, getting the issue of slavery guaranteed to come before the House of Representatives was, I think, a useful thing in retrospect. And that's what the Free Soilers managed to do. It isn't necessarily a force for evil, but it certainly is a force for disruption, a disruption of alliances and presumptions, conventions that had existed for a long time. It's possible for a small group of people, to really jack those up.
That's right. In retrospect, it was good that the country finally confronted the slavery issue, right?
Well,
But for the longest time, politicians of both major parties, talking about the Democrats and the Whigs, had tried to keep slavery out of national politics just because it was so dangerous.
Well, that's right. So, political stability then meant evading the great moral and political and social issue of the day, which was slavery, which, enslaved people and lots of other people were trying to push to the center of American politics. American politics has been constructed in a way to keep slavery out of the system. So it required people on the inside of politics to push it to the center, which is one of the things the Free Soilers did.
As has been pointed out, we haven't had a House speakership election go beyond one ballot since the 1920s, and before that, you have to go back to the Civil War era. 1849, Howell Cobb, a Unionist from Georgia, that was the longest speakership vote since John Taylor in 1820. Needed 22 ballots to prevail after Speaker Henry Clay resigned. So there were a few more multiple ballot speakership elections in the next couple of decades where it took 10 or 11 to decide it. But 1849 was really different. 63 ballots before Howell Cobb is eventually elected. And similar to today, there was a small faction, a small bloc that held the balance in an evenly divided chamber. In those days, it was 9 Free Soil Party Congress members, 9 of them. What did they want, Sean Wilentz?
Well, they wanted to make sure that issues of concern to them would get to the floor. The speaker gets to determine a great deal about what is going to be discussed and what's not going to be discussed. And that was really the issue all along, was what was going to be discussed. For a long time, and you see this in a number of different battles, the conventional party politicians were going to keep slavery out. They're going to keep it out, but in ways that were kind of advantageous to the slaveholders. Because if you kept things out, therefore the status quo was going to be sustained, therefore the slaveholders are going to be more powerful. But the Free Soil election, or rather the election of 1848 and the rise of the Free Soil Party as a vital force in American politics, one of the things they had to do in order to make their presence felt was to make sure they weren't going to be blocked anymore, that their issues were going to be able to come to the floor. And you mentioned actually in John Taylor going all the way back to 1820. Yeah. That's important too, because that was all about slavery as well. It was in the midst of the great Missouri crisis and the question of whether Missouri was going to be admitted as a slave state or not. John Taylor was, along with a man named James Talmadge, the great anti-slavery guy in Congress. So his getting the speakership was taken as an early victory from the anti-slavery forces. Now, in the end, a compromise was worked out, which, slavery was going to be admitted to Missouri. So Taylor's side kind of lost. He got the speakership anyway. But the point is only that the issue of slavery had already reared its head as early as the 1820s, and it scared a lot of people, which is why all through the 1830s into the 1840s, national politics was geared to the idea, as you said earlier, Martin, of keeping the slavery issue out because they didn't want to have a repeat of what had happened in 1820, which had led to John Taylor's being named Speaker. So in 1849, that was the issue. The issue was slavery, were these questions going to be allowed to be brought forward?
Howell Cobb becomes a secessionist later on. He actually served under Buchanan, I believe. He was in that. Yeah. In 1849, he was a Unionist from Georgia. Was he considered just somebody who was acceptable to both sides in the slavery debate?
He ended up being a compromise candidate. The character of pro-slavery politics had yet to shake itself out fully as well. Yeah. I mean, there were plenty of people like Cobb who were not, what should we say, they were not fire eaters as others were. They weren't Calhounites in quite the way that others were. Cobb was a Democrat. The idea was that he could be accepted. We're seeing a process here, as we're going to go through all of these examples, where the issue of slavery or the factions really do stiffen. They really become much more coherent. In 1849, it was still possible for a guy like Cobb to be acceptable. He was not their favorite person by any means. It was a victory really for the anti-slavery people in a funny way, because they held things up for long enough to make sure that they got some of what they wanted.
And often these compromises simply just deferred the issue till later on. They didn't really solve anything, which is an important point you made about the state of pro-slavery, anti-slavery politics at this time. It's not quite where it gets to in 1859 and 1849. We're going to talk about some of these important milestones on the way. But first, another point just about how elections were run in those days, something I still have trouble getting my mind wrapped around. You were elected in November. In this case, it would have been 1848. But the new Congress didn't come into play for 13 months the following December.
Correct.
That's crazy.
Well, they didn't have superhighways and stuff. It took a long time to get there. That was the idea. And also was to for there to be a cooling down period. It had to do with a lot of different things. But yes, you're right. Between the time you were elected and the time you were actually sworn in, a great deal could happen. And a great deal was happening in 1848, 49.
I think Abraham Lincoln could agree with that. A lot happened before the next Congress in December of 1860, so he had to take matters into his own hands, right?
It's one of the things about American politics that historians have to constantly tell people who are listening to them, to say that things were fundamentally different.
Yeah, well, neo-Confederates call Lincoln a tyrant because he was taking measures to save the Union because he couldn't wait for Congress to show up in December or whatever. Right?
When he show up.
Yeah.
Not they had to call him in a special session. Well, we'll talk about that later on.
1850, we're talking about Howell Cobb, 1849. But in 1850, we get the Compromise of 1850, which includes a new fugitive slave law. Very, very controversial. And then 1854, another major earthquake here. Kansas, Nebraska propels Abraham Lincoln back into national politics, worsens the fissures in the two major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. We don't have a Republican Party quite yet. But it's the 1854 KansasNebraska Act, which was passed in the spring of that year, which really sets the stage, right, for the House battle at the end of 1855, right?
Kansas-Nebraska did a terrible thing in that it basically repealed the Missouri Compromise from 1820, the thing that John Taylor had been involved in. It was going to admit Kansas and Nebraska without respect to slavery. So the line that had been drawn in 1820 was no longer going to be there. The agreement that had underwritten the idea of keeping slavery out of politics was now exploded, was now undone. So now, all of a sudden, slavery was really going to be at the center of politics, no matter what people said. This was something that Stephen A. Douglas, who was the man who kind of manufactured the KansasNebraska Act, he knew what was going on, but, he had other priorities. So we went along with it, pushed indeed by the F Street mess, by the hardline Southerners, pro-slavery Southerners. Political alignments were already unsettled, but Kansas-Nebraska really exploded them.
Because in those days, they were territories, and those territories were much larger than the current day states. People need to look at a map from 1854, see how large each of these territories were at the time. So the idea that slavery could enter both of these territories was, as I said, an earthquake. And there was violence immediately after this, right, in Kansas especially?
Yeah, it's the beginning of what's known as Bleeding Kansas. If the status of slavery is going to be determined by the voters themselves. This is the idea of popular sovereignty that was popularized a lot by Stephen A. Douglas. It meant that you were basically setting up a civil war in Kansas to determine whether pro-slavery or anti-slavery sides would prevail in shaping the Constitution, first of the territory, then of the state, when it wanted to apply for statehood. And so you had, in effect, a civil war in Kansas. That was beginning in 1855. Eventually, figures like John Brown and others are going to emerge for the first time well before the Civil War begins. So the violence is there. And then you get the question of how Congress is going to deal with all of that. And that's the next of these great speakership battles involving our friend Nathaniel Banks.
Yeah, before we get to 1856 Nathaniel Banks, a few more questions about what all of this was doing to the political parties, because you don't get a Nathaniel Banks and 100 and something ballots if everything is okay. So before the KnowNothings enter the picture here, what does Kansas-Nebraska do to the Democratic Party? Essentially, it damages the northern wing of the Democratic Party, right?
Yeah, I mean, they're already going all the way back to the 1840s. There already started to be anti-slavery defections from the Democratic Party, or rather the formation of a kind of anti-slavery sensibility or a group within the Democratic Party, which is why you get the Free Soilers in 1848. Even more important, that Kansas-Nebraska basically destroys the Whig Party. The Whig Party that had been there since the end of the 1830s, that had a northern wing and a southern wing, Kansas-Nebraska explodes it. You can practically date the death of the Whig Party to the moment when Kansas-Nebraska was passed. Because basically, the two wings of the Whig Party simply could not coexist peacefully as a party after Kansas-Nebraska. It blew things to smithereens. It relied on the compromise going back to 1820, the Missouri Compromise. It relied on that for its own stability. There were many, many anti-slavery Northerners in the Whig Party, tended to be in the Whig Party more than the Democratic Party, but the Southern Whig Party was full of very wealthy slaveholders. They were not going to be able to hold together as a party after Kansas-Nebraska. So yeah, one party is completely disintegrated, and another party is under great stress, the Democratic Party.
As you say on page 684 of The Rise of American, 684 out of how many? 12,
Yeah, it's a lot. Go ahead.
12,500, about 1,000, not even 1,000 pages. As you say, in The Rise of American Democracy. In the congressional elections here, well, there were state elections and congressional elections. I'll just give you a couple of sentences. The overwhelming message of that year's election results, we're talking 1854, post-Kansas-Nebraska, was the thoroughness with which Northern voters repudiated the badly divided Democrats. In 1852, you write, the Pierce-King ticket had won all but 2 Northern states. 2 years later, 1854, Democrats held control of only 2 Northern state legislatures, and in the House in the federal elections, the Northern Democratic congressional candidates took a drubbing, slashing the party's free state delegation in the House from 93 to 22, compared to 58 Southern Democrats in the new Congress. Into this maelstrom comes the KnowNothings, and that is also the entry point for our friend Nathaniel Banks. So slavery was such an important issue, but here we have a party running on nativism. But the KnowNothings also get overwhelmed by the anti-slavery movement, right?
Right. The disintegration of the Whig Party means that there are going to be lots of different factions coming out of it. There were lots of Northern anti-slavery Whigs, but not every Whig was anti-slavery or so anti-slavery. Some were very concerned about the immigration question and, the presence of all of these, Irish Catholics with their true loyalties to the Pope of Rome, et cetera, et cetera. It was a viable movement. It had been there since the 1830s and the 1840s in various places, but it exploded in the 1850s. Now, the question really that was going to have to be determined was which of these factions coming out of the Whig Party was going to become the new sectional Northern Party, because it was clear that whatever was going to happen, the Whig Party in the South was dead. They were all going to become Democrats, which they more or less did. The question was who was going to take the initiative, really, in Northern politics after 1854. And for a while, it looked as if the nativists actually might be the ones who would do so. They run a presidential candidate in 1856, an ex-president named Millard Fillmore, and, he gets, some Northern votes, border state votes in particular. So for a while, it looks as if, it's not going to be anti-slavery, it's going to be nativism that's going to carry what was the banner of the Whig Party is now going to be carried by nativists.
Now, you asked the question on page 685. Would the KnowNothings surpass the anti-slavery fusionists as the major political opposition to the Democrats in the North? And you say the odds seem to favor them after the 1854 elections, but much would depend on the struggle in Kansas, which was fast verging on civil war. You also make a point here in these pages to say how the anti-slavery men infiltrated the nativist camp and not the other way around.
Yeah. Well, here's where Nathaniel Banks comes in.
Yes, our friend.
Henry Wilson's another one, as I remember. Yes. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Massachusetts was the starting point here for those guys.
Well, Massachusetts is interesting because it is a place where nativism, obviously because of the presence of so many Irish Catholics, is going to be strong. But it becomes a place where people who have lots of different points of view, where anti-slavery people actually can come in, and as Banks did, come across as nativists. They call themselves Know-Nothings. They sometimes get elected as Know-Nothings. But they also have very strong anti-slavery feelings. And some of them, I think, from the very start, were hoping to be able to take the nativist movement, the Know-Nothing movement, and steer it towards an anti-slavery course. That's what ends up happening, and Banks is in the center of all of that.
So you refer to Banks as the politically savvy Democratic congressman from Waltham, a former factory worker and journalist known as the Bobbin Boy, who defects to the Know-Nothings. He eventually becomes a Republican. I mean, think of that today. Is it possible for any politician to maintain? Would it be possible today for somebody to go from one party to the next to the next? I mean, it just goes to show you how things were in flux at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, no two party disintegrations are the same. I mean, they take different dynamics. So, we can see what's going on today, but not read it from exactly the same script. But I mean, Banks is interesting because he's not a Whig, he's a Democrat. He's one of those Democrats who's alienated from the party precisely because the Southern slaveholders have been taking it over. And he comes from Waltham, a factory town in Massachusetts outside of Boston, one of the first factory towns, in fact, and becomes politically engaged. And yes, he's the Know-Nothings as his way forward, but he's also an anti-slavery Democrat. So he maneuvers his way into politics that way. And he becomes very important in the big speakership fight that we're going to talk about.
This is the 34th Congress of the United States. It's the election of 1854. And the result is Democrats, as we already said, take a real drubbing here. Congress convenes. There are only 82 Democrats, 51 Know-Nothings, and then a lot of members of Congress who are in what was basically like an opposition coalition. The Republican Party's not quite formed yet,
Right.
But they are anti-slavery people.
Right. The anti-slavery fusionists, they were sometimes called anti-Nebraska. There were some people calling themselves Republicans already, but they hadn't cohered as a national, let alone sectional force.
They are about to elect a speaker, and two people emerge right off the bat as contenders. Lewis Campbell, former Whig from Ohio, Nathaniel Banks, a former Democrat from Massachusetts. It takes 2 months. What was going on there? Why couldn't, I think we know the answer, right? It was slavery. But why would it take 2 months and more than 100 ballots to finally solve this thing?
Much like today. You had to get not simply a plurality, but you had to get a majority, an absolute majority. And that was, much like today, impossible to obtain for a very long time. Banks came close a couple of times, but it wasn't going to work, ballot after ballot after ballot. In that division, actually, they came up with the idea that they were talking about doing last week, which was to, all right, we're going to forget this majority business and we're going to go to a plurality, that whoever gets the most votes wins. It looked as if going in that direction was going to give the Southern candidate, in effect, the speakership, that they had counted that they could manage to pull off a plurality, if not a majority. We saw history kind of play itself out in that the idea of going to a plurality rather than a majority was at least floated during the Kevin McCarthy impasse. It didn't come to that. But in 1855-56, it did. The Southern Democrats, others thought that, this is going to be our way to get our guy through. But in fact, it turned out the opposite, that Banks managed to squeak through with a plurality, and he became the speaker.
103 out of 214 votes, amid deafening cheers, cries, and the waving of handkerchiefs. According to historian Corey Brooks, who just wrote a column about this in the Washington Post. And they tried everything to break the impasse. You would have to think there's probably lots of wheeling and dealing. There was, but they couldn't get Banks over the top. Apparently, they thought about these options to try to break the impasse, giving every member an up and down vote alphabetically until one received a majority. Also banning any more meat, drink, and fire.
Right. They were going to starve people into submission, and it was cold. So if they didn't have a fire, they didn't have a central heating or anything. They were trying to do anything they possibly could to come to a conclusion. This was a violent time, too. The little altercation you saw the night of McCarthy winning, where somebody confronted somebody and somebody's running over to Matt Gaetz and so on. You don't ordinarily see that kind of fisticuffs or semi-fisticuffs on the floor. That was much more common back in the 1850s. And some of that was going on, too. People were pretty angry because nothing was getting done. So, you saw all of those things happening.
So as 1856 finally unfolds with a new speaker, Banks, this didn't really settle anything, right? That's the point here. This was over an issue, not just a pure power play, kind of what we saw last week with McCarthy. This was over an issue, slavery, and Banks was, I don't know if you want to call him a compromise candidate. I guess he was.
Well, I think that he was actually the anti-slavery guy. Everybody regarded him, even though he was a nativist, ex-Democrat nativist. Everybody, he wasn't there to spend a lot of time pushing nativist issues. People aligned him with the anti-slavery people. So it wasn't so much a compromise as he was, the victory of that side. Now, he wasn't the most radical of the anti-Nebraska people. He wasn't even formally an anti-Nebraska person. But, it was a sign, in fact, I think, of what was to come in the Republican Party. The Republican Party was this is a step in the formation of the Republican Party, is what I'm saying. Because by the time we get to the fall of 1856, the Republican Party has formed. It does have a candidate in John C. Fremont. It is going to run a very strong campaign. But the fact that Banks managed to win in 1855 told you something about where anti-slavery politics was going.
An anti-slavery party, as Corey Brooks wrote in this column, however moderate, he says, would now control one house of Congress, even though, as we mentioned, the Republicans weren't the party they would become a couple of years later. It was kind of like
That's
an
correct.
opposition. Yeah.
It wasn't so moderate, actually. In the context of the politics of the 1850s, one of the reasons the Southerners were so upset is that these guys were becoming much more radical. And you had people in that party, in that grouping, people like Salmon Chase and so forth, who are, political abolitionists. So it was moderate in the sense that they weren't the Garrisonians, but maybe that wasn't the proper measure of what radical or moderate actually was. Yeah. It was much more at stake, in fact, than one might imagine. But still, he's right. This showed that anti-slavery political opinion was congealing in the Congress and congealing sectionally as well.
Yeah, this wasn't just a party battle. It was sectional.
Well, and it was about slavery, one big central issue, which we can talk about. Whether that's the case today or not. I think it's actually more the case today than people allow. But the issue is not slavery. The issue is liberal government itself, which a lot of people in the Republican Party, not just the crazy 20, actually want to see happen. That's the issue, it seems to me. But we can get to that later on.
We'll circle back to the present moment because we have one more speakership battle to get to. This is 1859. So our friend Banks is finally the speaker, 1856. The violence in Kansas continues. We get something called the Lecompton Constitution at some point. 1857 is Dred Scott. Preston Brooks beats the living daylights out of Senator Sumner. And as you write, in the rise of American democracy, referring to the speakership battle that puts William Pennington in charge of the House from New Jersey, your neck of the woods. That's right. I think he was the only Speaker of the House, or he was the first Speaker of the House not to win re-election. So
wasn't he a freshman, too? I think he was the first. I mean,
yeah.
he was.
So here's what you write about the 1859 Speakership Battle, which took place, as I mentioned, after a number of other major events on the road to the Civil War. Preston Brooks, Dred Scott, ongoing violence in Kansas. The struggles among the sectional and intra-party factions carried over to the new Congress in December. Selection of the Speaker of the House had been an arduous process for several sessions, and the 2-month battle that commenced in December 1859, only days after John Brown's execution, speaking of important milestones, we have the Harper's Ferry raid, would prove nastier still. But you say the proximate cause of the turmoil was not Brown's raid, but Hinton Helper's The Impending Crisis. This was a book.
Yeah. Politics inside Congress and politics outside Congress connect. Hinton Rower and Helper was a North Carolinian who had written a book called The Impending Crisis. He was a white Southerner. And the book was basically an attack on the slaveholding class in the South, saying that it was oppressing not just the slaves, who Helper was not particularly enamored of, but that's another story. But he said it was hurting poor whites, and that the entire system of slavery was one that was bad for the country, but particularly bad for the poor whites of the South. It was sort of a class analysis, if you will, but within the white population, holding even slavery aside, that slavery as a system was bad for white Southerners. Now, this obviously caused a great furor in the South by 1857 when the thing was published. He had to publish it in New York because no Southern press was going to publish this thing. And it was burned. I mean, it was basically banned and burned and considered to be the height of treason and trying to, incite white people up against the slavery system. So Helper was very, very controversial. He was very popular, however, with Northerners in this anti-Nebraska Republican Party in formation, including a man named John Sherman. John Sherman's a very interesting character who I think actually should get more attention than he's due. He was the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman, who was going to become a great general in the Civil War. But he was a moderate. Talk about where Corey's absolutely right. He was a moderate Republican from Ohio. He was not an abolitionist in quite the sense that some of them were. He was not a fire-breathing Republican. But he signed a letter that endorsed Helper's book. And that, to the Southerners, made him persona non grata. He could not be named Speaker having endorsed Helper's book.
That's why you say guilt by association with the impending crisis was enough to block Sherman's elevation on ballot after ballot. You go on to write, Sean Wilentz, again, page 756. The rhetoric on both sides in both the House and Senate became so vicious. James Hammond remarked that the only persons who don't have a revolver and a knife are those who have 2 revolvers. After 44 ballots, but before any shooting started, you write, Sherman withdrew in favor of a bland Republican New Jerseyan who had supported the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 and whom the Upper South deemed safe enough. And that was Pennington.
That was Pennington, and he was the. I should have given him his name. I feel bad that I didn't do that back then. But that's okay.
No index entry for Pennington in your book. That's all right.
I'll have to change that when I finally get around to doing a new edition of the book. But so that's what happened. That really was a bland compromise candidate. However, it wasn't going to be J.H. Hammond or anybody like him, any of his acolytes in the House. It was, again, one of these things where, you were trying to put a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage.
So to tie up the 1850s part here before we circle back, and it's really a segue to the present moment. 1859, we're on the verge of the Civil War. Of course, people don't know that is coming, but talk of secession and disunion were, of course, in the air.
Right.
The Whigs are gone. They're dead. The Democrats are split or on the verge of splitting into a Northern and Southern party. And the Republicans are coalescing around their opposition to the extension of slavery. And, of course, Lincoln saying putting slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. So I guess it's a little different than what's happening today. I don't know. I don't know how different. I don't know how many of these parallels apply. I just get a sense that they do, that we are seeing something strange happening here.
Well, we are, but I think there actually is an issue, as I said earlier, Martin. And I think the issue has to do with not just one thing, as slavery, as the great social and economic and cultural, et cetera, moral issue. It has to do with government and the place of government in American life. And for a very long time, going back to Ronald Reagan, his famous speech, which is sometimes misquoted, and he wasn't quite as radical as it sounded, but the idea that, in the current crisis, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. Famous line from his first inaugural address.
It is time to reawaken this industrial giant, to get government back within its means, and to lighten our punitive tax burden. And these will be our first priorities, and on these principles there will be no compromise.
Look, anti-government has been a theme for the conservative / right wing in American politics since the New Deal. And we're seeing in some ways a culmination of all of that. Now it's taken on many, many different colorations, and the culture wars you throw in and all the rest of it. It's all there. We can go on to the detailed history of that. But I think in some ways that's what it's coming down to. The band of 20 or the crazies, or whatever you want to call them in the House, they are dedicated to making this government not work. Pure and simple.
Many of their colleagues in the House who voted for McCarthy are not totally against what they want to do. They maybe disagree with their methods.
Yeah, I mean, they're not. Look, there's been a process of radicalization that's been going on since Reagan in many ways, but certainly since Gingrich in the mid-'90s.
And Buchanan.
And you've seen again and again and again this process whereby people who are further and further to the right, more and more inflammatory, more and more given to radical, almost terroristic politics, exceed the people who came before them. So, so you start with the people who were there, say, in the Clinton impeachment in 1998, the likes of Henry Hyde and so forth, being driven by Gingrich. But then you get Tom DeLay, and then you get, people like that coming who are much, much more inflammatory.
Scorched earth politics.
Yeah, it's a bit like the French Revolution, except there's no Thermidor. One crazy faction takes over from another crazy faction. And the party always promises more than it can keep, so it gets the base all upset. And finally, you end up with Trump, who understood the dynamics, understood how angry people were, even at their most radical Republicans, and commandeered the party and took it over. Now, this is a long history. It's nothing that's coming out of nowhere. It certainly didn't start with Trump. It didn't even start with Gingrich in the 90s. It's been going on in some ways since the New Deal, but there was a period where the Republican Party made its peace with the New Deal, the Eisenhower Republicans. Richard Nixon was not one of these people, but something happened in the 80s, and Reagan was a part of this, even though Reagan was a much different kind of character and much more political, but it unleashed a force in American politics, which was a great reaction. If you're as old as I am, Martin, and I'm an old man now.
As old as Nathaniel Banks. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, not quite. But if you grew up in the 1950s as opposed to the 1850s, you looked at the way that the country was going and the world affairs was going since World War II, and you think this was normal. It was a period of liberal government. It was a period when government was expanding for the good of the Commonwealth. It was a period where, indeed, the economy was doing very, very well. It was a period when organized labor was legitimate. It was a period when civil rights was on the march. It looked like everything was headed towards an expansion of the New Deal. But then it turns out that period was an aberration. It was not normal. It was not the wave of the future, and it was going to be undone. And what we've seen since the 1980s certainly is that undoing of all of that. But in that process, it's also become much more radical. So if you were asking about the speakership fight, last week, looking back and comparing it to what happened in the 19th century, I think that there is a central issue here. It involves much more than one thing like slavery. It involves deregulation. It involves civil rights. It involves the social stuff and the coloration of the evangelical right coming into it. All of that is there. But it is a unified reactionary idea that is focused on government as the enemy. I think that's what we're up against now. And
I agree that this faction does see its own government as the enemy of millions of people.
Yeah,
to your earlier point, not to go over the entire 20th century, but if you grew up in the 1950s, probably even a little bit into the 1960s before inflation starts becoming a real problem, then Vietnam, then Watergate, and then eventually, New Deal liberalism is a spent force. But if you grew up in that era, you believed your government was on your side. You saw it help you get through two major crises: the Great Depression, capital M, capital C, major crises, Great Depression, World War II.
Correct.
So in the 1980s, though, you do see some of these fissures. You mentioned to me in one of our recent conversations that instead of trying to find the roots of Trumpism, or in addition to trying to find the roots of Trumpism and George Wallace populism, that I should look at Pat Buchanan as well. And I did. I did a whole episode about Pat Buchanan with Nicole Hemmer, historian of the New Right.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, you see some of these potential splits on the right in the 80s, but they don't break out into the open until the Cold War comes to an end.
Right.
And our focus changes more towards domestic politics and less towards the world. I mean, Buchanan's speech in late 1991, a couple months before he has a really strong showing in the 1992 New Hampshire primary, wins about a third of the votes against the incumbent president, George H.W. Bush. He could have made that speech today, or Trump could have made that same speech today. So speaking of Trump, what's his role in what we're seeing here?
Oh,
I mean, some people said it was a loss for him, or it was good for him that McCarthy won.
I think I've heard people say that he was dissed and so forth, and that Lauren Boebert was dissing him. Look, the situation is very volatile as far as Trump is concerned, but there's no question that his side won. He's gotten two things now. He's gotten Kevin McCarthy as his speaker. My Kevin, as he calls him, is now going to be the Speaker of the House. Trump was always going to be Speaker in effect anyway, as long as he had Kevin McCarthy there. But now he's got these people, maybe they were holding out and doing their own theatrics. And nevertheless, they have made their way forward because of Trump. Above all, they've now hijacked and become, in effect, the real speakers of the House. I don't see how Trump loses through all of that. I see all of that as advancing Trump. But even apart from Trump as a personality, it advances where the Republican Party has gone. It advances Trumpianism, even beyond Trump, so that it's even in some ways scarier. For example, I think that, and you're seeing some punditry about this finally now, I think that the concessions that McCarthy gave to become speaker really put the whole debt ceiling issue really in danger. Yeah. I mean, there was a point where Ted Cruz can get up in the Senate and threaten to have the U.S. government go into default and blow up the economy, but that wasn't going to happen. I'm not so sure that won't happen this time.
Or can be used as a leverage chip.
Well, for everything. I mean, if you're threatening Armageddon or disaster or, meltdown, Chernobyl meltdown, in exchange for anything you want, including ending Social Security or cutting it to the bone, Medicare to the bone, the FBI, the IRS. Why stop? Why not do everything? Why not go for the max? That's what these people are thinking about doing. And that's the danger that I see now with the weakened speaker, because the speaker could hold things together more or less and keep these people more or less in line, at least in the House. I think that this is really very, very dangerous.
Americans don't want the far left or the far right. They don't want any of the stuff you just described, that maybe the 20 rogues, or whatever they were called, the irreconcilables might be calling for. So, I mean, that maybe is some solace here. I'll wrap up with one final thought, and it's another comparison or analogy to the 1850s. In the 1850s, there was an issue. What will break this cycle of polarization? We know what happened, right? There was secession and then civil war. I don't think we're going to have a civil war or secession here, but what will it take? And this is really asking you to predict the future, which is impossible to do. What's it going to take to break this fever and get back to a more normal politics, if that's possible?
It's going to take the Republican Party to fall apart, or rather be so disgraced that it doesn't hold national power in the way that it does now. I'm not saying that as a Democrat, although my politics are pretty well known. I'm not saying that as a Democrat. I'm saying that as an American, or even as an historian. I think the only way to stop it is to stop it. And look, there are some Democrats I've heard who are kind of happy at what happened, because they say, as you just said, Martin, that the American people will not stand for this, that they don't want this to happen. But man, the damage that can happen between now and that reckoning in 2024.
Yeah, they were laughing about what was happening last week. I was not laughing.
Yeah, I was not laughing at all. It was very scary. Actually, I think of all the people that I heard, not that many people were speaking about it, but I thought actually the president did a good job of putting it in perspective, which is this is yet another attack on American institutions. And that's what this is. It was an attack by the, what are we going to call them? The what the F faction of the Republican Party, taking things over in a way. Look, it was not for nothing, or rather the irony, it wasn't an irony at all. The convergence of the fact that this was happening on January 6th on the floor of the House, 2 years after the other scenes inside the floor of the House. What you saw was the unruliness getting out of hand in January 6th in 2021, that side was winning in a parliamentary way in 2023. To me, the connection was really quite striking, but therefore all the more frightening, because this was now being done legitimately. It was being done on the floor of the House with a certain degree of, tension, but nevertheless it got done. And they achieved far more than the rioters did, because they actually managed to take hold of an institution in a way that the rioters had no intention of actually doing. Look, I have no prediction. I'm an historian. It's hard enough for me to figure out what happened in the past, let alone what's going to happen today, and certainly not what's going to happen in the future. But all of that said, I think that this is as dangerous a time in terms of the temper, the real contempt, I think, that a lot of people feel for the basic institutions of American democracy. That really is what's frightening me right now, or the combination of contempt and passivity and indifference. That's what's frightening. Now, people looked back on November and said, aha, the American people have stood up and they want to defend these ideas. But what you saw was a small faction of people taking advantage of the political system in such a way as they turned a MAGA defeat into a gigantic MAGA victory, which is what happened last week. Now, what that tells me is that the political system itself may be heading in directions that are really disastrous, despite what the American people might desire.
Which means that our democracy is a charade, if that's the case.
Well, it's not a charade yet. Look, I don't want to be so gloomy as all of that. Yeah. I mean, there are elections. Things can happen. I'm counting on things actually turning around in 2024. That can very well be the case.
Well, the notion that we could have 2 years of dysfunction here because of what just happened is...
What I'm saying is that, yes, that it's going to be a very, very rocky road for American democracy. Look, I'm a happy warrior. I'm a happy person. I'm always trying to be optimistic. I always am optimistic. It's just that, as I say, when I looked at TV, you asked me at the very beginning, Martin, what I was thinking when I watched what was going on last week in the House. It was frightening to me rather than anything amusing. It portended very, very poorly for the next 2 years.
Well, I'm an optimist and a happy person too, Sean Wilentz, which puzzles people when they find out that I'm a fan of the New York Jets.
Yeah, well,
And on a humorous note.
Yeah, right. I mean, as a Yankee fan, we haven't won since 2009. We're supposed to be the evil empire. But, man, I mean, no empire where I'm sitting, as evil as we might be. So
I was making a joke about your long book before. If you were to write a book titled Greatest Moments in Jets History, it could be done in 10 minutes.
It would be the Weeby Eubank Joe Namath chapter, and that would be it.
A one-pager.
Yeah.
Well, there it is. Sean Wilentz and I have discovered one topic that is definitely more depressing than politics, the New York Jets. Sean Wilentz, as always, we thank you for your insights. On the next episode of History as It Happens, I know I mentioned last week that we'd be covering the War Powers Resolution and the ongoing conflict in Yemen, but what happened in the House has made us change our plans a bit. We'll get to War Powers in Yemen in a couple of episodes. We're going to stick, however, in our next episode with the House divided. And that is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.